Is it working? Oh, whoa, that's super loud. Hello and welcome. Thank you for spending the evening with us. I'm Dr. Susan Coleman, the Assistant Superintendent of Student Services here at Lake Zurich, and I'm happy to introduce to you Lisa Warren, who's not only a board member, but a coalition chair of the ELA Coalition. On behalf of the District 95 and the ELA Coalition Against Youth Substance Abuse, I welcome you to this presentation today by Dr. Erin Weiner and an emerging drug trends with youth and what you as parents can do about that. At the end of this, we will have some time for questions, so if you have any, keep them in mind, and then we also have our fellow law enforcement officers here as well as our SRO from the high school if there are any other questions relating to that. Okay, so I hope you enjoy the show.
So I'd like to introduce Dr. Weiner. He is a licensed clinical psychologist, and he is also the director of addiction services at the Linden Oaks Behavioral Health. He has earned his doctorate from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and completed his fellowship in addiction psychology at the VA Ann Arbor Healthcare System. He is a strong advocate for evidence-based care in treating chemical dependency and behavioral addictions, as well as a proponent for integrating behavioral health services into medical settings. Dr. Weiner is passionate about educating both healthcare professionals and the general public about the nature and treatment of addiction, helping medical teams provide compassionate, competent care, and empowering patients to be informed consumers about their addiction treatment options. Dr. Weiner is a member of the board for the Society of Addiction Psychology, and he is also on the Science Advisory Board for Smart Approaches to Marijuana. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Weiner to Lake Zurich.
Thank you. All right, good evening, everybody. So I'm going to be right up close with you guys. Hopefully that's all right. It's a smaller crowd, so I'm not going to be far back. But I appreciate you guys coming out tonight. As mentioned, I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. I direct the addiction service line at Linden Oaks Behavioral Health, which is kind of far away. We're down in Naperville, but I live in Long Grove, so that gives me a little bit of Northwest Suburbs cred. So there's that. But I speak out on this very, very frequently on E-cigs, on vaping, on marijuana, because what I've noticed is that there is a tremendous gap between what we know in addiction medicine, what we see in medical journals, and what you hear coming out of the mouths of young people and older people and everybody in between. There's a lot of false narratives, and part of where this comes from is that addiction is kind of an odd issue in that there's actually people peddling the disease. So like I work for a behavioral health hospital, right? And no one, we treat depression and we treat anxiety and trauma and all of that, but nobody is selling PTSD, nobody is selling depression. But someone is literally selling addiction and making money through public information, misinformation, deception, and getting young people hooked. Because 90% of all addictions, if you're going to have a problem with addiction in your life, you're going to have your first one before you hit age 20. And if you're in the business of being an addiction profiteer, you know this, which is why most drugs and drug trends tend to target the young. And both of these industries are no different. So my hope for you today is that you'll hear something that you didn't already know, and that you'll be able to use it to have conversations, because that's really where we are right now. I don't mean to be defeatist about it, but kind of what I'm noticing when we step back and when we look at policy, when we look at politics, when we look at profits and trends and industry, is that you've got these rises and falls. And like if you look at cigarettes, for example, and how long it took for this country to get that type of nicotine delivery system under control, that was maybe like 50 years between when it really started to take hold and when we finally got it back under control. And by under control, we're still losing literally 480,000 people a year due to cigarette-related deaths. So that's kind of the legacy of that in this country. And so when we look at vaping, when we look at marijuana and what's going on right now, what we're seeing is industries on the front end of that curve. And I don't know necessarily, I'm not naive enough to think that we can just cut that off. There's way too much money. There's a lot of momentum behind this. But my hope is that through education, through having important conversations, we can look at the curve that these addictive industries are on, and we can make them plateau at a lower amount and then start coming back down again on the far end. Because if you look at what happened with cigarettes and nicotine, like way back when, that was cool, right? Everybody smoked. All the movie stars smoked, cartoons smoked, everybody smoked. Now you ask your average young person about smoking, and they say it's disgusting. That's not an accident. That took a lot of work from a lot of people for a long time. And so the thought is, well, maybe we can learn from the past. And the way that we do that, again, is through knowledge and through conversations and through speaking the truth. So that's my hope for tonight. We're going to start with vaping and nicotine, and we're going to move into marijuana. We're going to talk a little bit as parents about how to approach these subjects. It's tricky. There's no one algorithm for this, but there's some best practices that we can talk about. And then at the end, we should have some time for some questions too. That said, along the way, if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand. If it's too complicated, I'll say no, and then I'm joking. Feel free. Otherwise, I'm just going to be yammering at you for 90 minutes, which can work, but sometimes it's a little better if we have a dialogue. So with that, also forgive me. I'm going to either be looking over there at my very small screen or behind myself a little bit tonight, but we're going to make it work together. So e-cigs and vaporizers, what are these things? At their core, what these things are, it's a device to heat a substance to release a chemical. So anytime you are trying to get a chemical out of a substance, you have to release it somehow. So you could eat it, and then your stomach digests it, gets soaked in through the stomach lining. You could smoke it, where you light it on fire, and the combustion is what releases the chemical, and then it gets absorbed through the lungs. Or in the case of vaping, you can superheat it to the point where the chemical is released below the point of combustion, so it doesn't light on fire. And the idea behind this is that anytime you light something on fire, it's not as good for you. It creates carcinogens. That's why we don't eat burnt toast. That's why we're not supposed to eat overly charred barbecue. Lighting it on fire is worse. And so the idea here is if you don't light it on fire, it's not as bad. Spoiler alert, that's true. Other spoiler alert, that doesn't mean that it's not bad for you. And we'll talk a lot more about the specifics in a minute, but that's really all vaping is. And if you look up there, they come in a lot of different shapes and sizes. These larger ones, sometimes called mods, have tanks. There's a cigarette look-alike, essentially. Some are more pen-like. Juuls are a type of these as well, and we'll talk more about that company and product in a minute. But they all have some similar features, regardless of the form factor. On the bottom, you've got a handle with a battery. This one allows you to adjust the resistance. So there's a lot of customizability with this product, and this is one way that you can do it. The lower the resistance, the faster the heating coil heats up and can actually influence the type of vapor, of aerosol that you make and how the experience of breathing it in is. But so you've got this battery in the bottom. You either turn it on or off with a switch or with inhaling. When you inhale, it completes the circuit and activates the device. This one is a nicotine vape pen. So you've got either a tank, which is what you're seeing here, that you refill with liquid, or you have disposable pods where you throw them away, a la Juul. But either way, what happens is that you bring the liquid up to a heating coil around the top. This one titrates it up with 4 different wicks, and then that heats it up and you inhale through the mouthpiece. And that is a vape pen. Again, the idea here is that it's less harmful because you're not lighting things on fire, and all the different shapes and sizes all kind of come back to the same general principle. Wet vaping is what nicotine is. Dry vaping is what you do when you're using marijuana flower or concentrates. So if you guys are not familiar with marijuana concentrates, get ready. January 1st is coming. What these things are is like wax, shatter, butter. These are very, very, very potent THC concentrates that can be up to 90, 95% THC and are associated with the vast majority of harm from THC. More on that second half of the presentation. But what you do is you take, so if you've heard of dabbing, that's not like the dance, but like actually like doing it with THC. You put a dab of it on the vape pen and then use it that way. One of the issues with the rise of the vape pen has actually been that it's made this way of consuming THC a lot more accessible, because previously what you had to do was have a modified bong with something called a nail, and then you use literally a butane torch or a blowtorch to heat it up and then consume it that way. That's a little more cumbersome. You're more likely to burn your house down, so it's a lot easier to just stick it in a vape pen and do it that way. The problem, again, is that this is the most harmful for the developing mind. This has the most destructive capacity. And again, we'll talk more about this. in the second half of the presentation, but it's taken the worst product in terms of harm and made it the most accessible. And that's part of what we're dealing with right now with youth and THC vaping. So let's talk about Juul. Juul is just another type of vape pen, but they happen to be juggernauts in the vape industry. They own, I think, this is an older graph, but right now it's about 75% of the market share in vaping, which is like Amazon-style dominance of something. You know, like where Juul goes, everything else goes. For those who aren't aware, this is what they look like. You know, it's smaller than you know, this presentation remote. You can generally fit it in your fist, and this is part of also why it's caught on, because you could say use it in a classroom and then either hold the vapor in your lungs until it dissipates or blow it out into heavy clothing, particularly easy in the winter, and no one would necessarily even see it. So it's much easier to be stealthy about it. They come, you use pods that you discard afterwards that have about a pack's worth of nicotine in each. And they used to come in flavors. Actually, about 6 weeks ago now-ish, Juul did pull all flavors other than menthol and tobacco to mimic cigarettes. Now, this was in response to a threat of a federal ban, and they were selling these things for years. But now there's fewer that you can buy. And actually, I'm going to pop over here and pull up my first website. I'm going to do this a little bit while we're talking today. I'm a fan of showing, not just telling. But this is Juul's website, and you can see here's the flavors that they have left, tobacco and menthol. And if we go down here, you can see it's not particularly difficult to buy these. Like, you know, $15 for these models and $19 for the limited edition Aqua device. You know, that's not like prohibitively expensive. You know, you mow a lawn, you can get another Juul. So that's part of when we're talking about, you know, like what do schools do about this? What can you do about it? Confiscating is like, just like confiscating device is like taking Advil for a brain tumor. You know, it's like maybe your headache gets a little bit better, but the problem's still there. Like the reason why you're having the headache is still going to exist. So it's really more like if a young person is vaping, the real question is why, not how. Like the how can get replaced. The question is what's pulling them into this in the first place. So Juul grew really, really quickly. This is a graph. Reuters did a great investigative article on this. I encourage you to look it up. Came out about maybe like a month ago. But this is the Juul market share in the vape category, and this is everybody else. So you can see that like they were clearly in an upward trend, and this was very much on purpose, and it has to do with the way that Juul is formulated. So this is from their patent application. And Juul literally made an e-cigarette that intentionally delivers a hit of nicotine to the blood faster even than regular cigarettes, and a lot faster than other cigarettes, because what they were finding is this benzoic acid when you add it. What they were finding is that regular e-cigarettes, people would try them, and only 1 out of 5 people would use it afterwards. But when you use a Juul with their formula, it was 58%, so almost 3 out of 5 people would continue to use a Juul afterwards. And again, the idea here is if people are using this for the nicotine buzz, hit them with it, you know, and then they're much more likely to stick around. They were told, part of what this Reuters article did was they uncovered that there were people early in the process of Juul's development that said, hey, this is going to make it a lot more likely to hook kids. And they just kind of blew past that. And here we are, right? But that's part of why this is, when you see this sort of rapid increase, well, they took one design and they made a change that made it that much more effective. What the benzoic acid does essentially, part of it is that it makes it taste milder. The other element is that it makes it more bioavailable in the lungs, which go much more quickly into the blood than your mouth and throat. So when it gets down there, it gets in a lot more quickly. So it's extra habit forming literally by design. And this was the result. So they say things like they don't want kids to use their product, but a new study found that teens are 16 times more likely than older age groups to use it. This was from about a year ago. And so like if you back off from this a second and think about Juul as a business, which it is, if 16 out of 17 of your customers are teenagers, what would happen if teenagers stopped using your product? You know, like you'd go belly up. You actually couldn't do that. And this is part of how the entire addiction industry works. Because again, it always skews young. that also skews towards addiction. You cannot be an addiction profiteer without addiction. There was a study that came out maybe about 15 years ago that looked at big alcohol, so things like Anheuser-Busch, Coors, et cetera. And what they found was that 75% of big alcohol's profits comes from the top 10% of users. These are the people who are drinking 10 drinks a day or more. So you literally cannot have Anheuser-Busch without alcoholism. You couldn't do it. And so when they say things like drink responsibly, that sounds great, but if people listen to them, they'd go out of business. And that's the way these industries work. There's the public-facing thing and what they say, and then on the back end is what they do and what actually supports them. And they oftentimes diverge. They go in two very different directions. A big part of it has to do with flavors. And actually, these are flavored cigars. You can still find these, but flavors were banned in cigarettes, which were the most popular way of consuming nicotine for kids, literally 10 years ago. We banned flavors in cigarettes with the Tobacco Control Act of 2009, and we did that because we know that flavors are disproportionately attractive to young people. We've known this. We've known this literally for decades. The reason why vapes can do it is that they are not cigarettes. They are a nicotine delivery system. They're an NDS, an electronic NDS, and so they aren't subject to all the same restrictions that we put on cigarettes to prevent youth use. But when you look at what's going on here, this was a study that looked at flavor preferences between 2017 and 2019. You can see that the top category of flavors that kids prefer, high school students, is fruit. And then menthol or mint, and it's been shown actually that that's far more mint than menthol. Here's candy or dessert. And then other is the tobacco flavor. So again, when you're Juul and most of your flavors are fruit, menthol and mint, and candy or dessert, and you say that you just want to appeal to adult smokers, it doesn't really match up. And this is how they were first advertising. Really great article by the New York Times, Did Juul lure teenagers and get customers for life? But when you look at these models, like if you ask yourself, does this look like it's angled at the 55-year-old chain smoker demographic? No, right? It doesn't. This is clearly angled at young people. And the younger people, like teenagers, who look up to young people. I mean, I don't think anyone could get away with wearing ripped jeans over the age of 22. You know what I'm saying? So, I mean, this is where they started. As part of a congressional hearing that happened in July, ninth graders said that Juul went into their classroom and called the device totally safe. And they've been found to spend $200,000 on social media influencers, and you don't go on Instagram, you don't go on Facebook, you don't go on these platforms to attract the 40 and up crowd. You just don't. It's not where that demographic is going. So again, what they might be saying one thing, but then when you actually look at what's going on, it's moving in a very different direction. You also may or may not be aware that a year ago, Altria bought into Juul at the tune of $13 billion. So Altria is the parent group it's a big tobacco group that owns Marlboro. And they bought a 35% stake and actually now own their CEO. So the longtime CEO of Juul stepped down about 3 months ago and was replaced by a longtime Altria exec. So now they're very much in charge of Juul. They literally sold out to big tobacco. Which we've already discussed has done a number of really negative things to our country. And what's interesting about this is that when this happened, there were a number of Juul employees who didn't want that. They didn't want to literally sell out to big tobacco. And so the next day, and these were headlines that I grabbed off the internet, right? So here's December 20th. On December 21st, 1.5 thousand Juul employees get an average holiday bonus. Every Juul employee got a bonus of over $1 million last year. Every single one. Which is like, well, if you have a problem with this, here's $1 million. How do you feel about it now? This is how this industry works, right? Huge amounts. You settle lawsuits out of court because you'll make more money doing that and continuing to sell your product. You spend huge amounts on lobbying. This is standard for big tobacco. This is how this works. And now these guys are driving Juul. There's a couple more examples of this. Prior to that congressional hearing, they crossed quarterly lobbying payouts for $1 million. So they were on track for $4 million in lobbying payouts a year at that point. And again, why do you give that much money to politicians? Probably not because you want them to improve the safety of products and impose flavor bans. Back in August, the main vaping industry group in the country sued the FDA because the FDA says Hey, there's a lot of people dying from a mystery vaping epidemic. We'd like to review the quality of your products because actually the FDA hasn't done this. We have no idea really what's in the majority of these vape liquids. That's something that I think a lot of kids don't know. These things are produced overseas in China. They're shipped in. The FDA has not reviewed them, which is why they asked for companies to submit them for safety review by May of 2020, May of next year. And they sued the FDA saying that's too soon. We want more time. That's in court right now. And in San Francisco, which was the very first place to ban vape sales due to public health concerns, they spent $4.3 million alone there to try to keep their product on the shelf. And again, they're not doing that because they believe so strongly that this is going to prevent cancer over time from San Franciscans. You know, like that's not what's going on here. This is about money because this is a business. And again, this is how big tobacco works. This is how it's about using the population for money for as long as you can because it is a cash cow. As long as you can do this, it's worth it to you because that's truly what these things are about. And I think it's also interesting to know, you may or may not have caught this, but the makers of PAX invite you to the Juul launch party. This wasn't like born out of some lab from like University of Wisconsin that's like trying to create a healthier way to consume nicotine. PAX Labs actually are the people who they're one of the #1 producers of THC and marijuana vape pens. And if you look at the PAX era, that looks a lot like a Juul. That's because that's where it came from. Like this is, all these industries are very linked. Again, addiction for profit is something that spans, if you look at who's investing in marijuana right now, by the way, on the corporate level, that's an interesting search, by the way, just if you type invest in marijuana, you might be very surprised at what you see, or maybe not. But you'll see actually that this is where a lot of the big addiction companies are investing in right now because they understand there's money here. It's not about health, it's not about wellness, it's about cash. So going back to, moving back from the business and more to the product, let's talk about vaping jargon. So there's like a whole language to this because this is a subculture. So one of the things that's so appealing to young people about drug use is that you're at a time in your life where you want to belong. You want to be part of something, you want to fit in. And when it comes to drugs, you do not have to be smart. You don't have to be funny. You don't have to be attractive. You don't have to have skills. All you have to do is put the substance in your body and you're part of the group. Just do the drugs and you're part of the group. And so it's this great social equalizer. If you're having trouble fitting in other things, this is a way you can fit in with very few strings attached. And so it becomes part of an identity. It becomes part of what you do. And with any subculture, there's a lot of things that go along with it. Paraphernalia, clothing items, expressions, vocabulary. And vaping is no different. So there's a website that you can really dive into for a while if you want to, called From Amps to Zero, the A to Z of vaping. And we're not going to go through all these because it would take a long time. But I mean, this is kind of like if you remember back to skateboard culture in like the 80s and 90s and where someone could like tell you exactly what they're doing in 30 seconds and you'd have no idea about any of the words they used. This is kind of the same thing. But there are a couple that I think are worth knowing so that you can follow along at least a little bit. The first is vape juice. This is the liquid that goes into an e-cigarette. No one calls it e-liquid, that's the technical term, but everyone's going to call it vape juice. The throat hit is the feeling of nicotine, the vapor, when it hits the back of your throat, and some people like it, some people don't. You can modify the feel depending on the type of juice that you use. And then vape tricks. So you can actually, this is maybe the skill side of it, you can actually do things with the vape aerosols. So I just want to show you guys a couple of what these things are. And there's a lot more where this came from. Again, the rabbit hole goes deep if you just Google this and like look on YouTube and such, but here's a few. So here is the dragon. Let's see here, all right. Here, out of all of his face holes. Let's go to the next one. Here is the tornado. Kind of cool, right? Now, one of the things that I'll point out about this one too is that if you think about how fast it went away, the mist dissipated from the dragon one. And now look at how long, it's like just sitting there on the counter. This is, again, how you can customize what the vapor is, how long it lasts, what you do with it. There's a lot that you can do. And here is someone, I guess this is where smoke rings are going, double, triple O's. My favorite part about this one is the one that's just like dribbling out of his left nostril. I see it right there. Just dribble, dribble, dribble. But like, so what's interesting about this, to me, right, is like if you look at this, and you like, I don't look at this and I'm like, I want to be this guy's friend. You know, this is not like magnetic to me. But for some people, this is actually really cool, right? And this is what culture is all about, right? Some people are like, wow, look at what this guy can do. I want to do that too. And so a lot of this, again, has to do with what's cool, what's in, what's trendy. A lot of that has to do with social media influencers, branding, marketing, all, again, directed. Because, again, I would also hazard to say that this does not appeal to the 30 and 40 and up crowd, right? Like those people are not looking at this and being like, I have to be able to blow out O's out of every hole in my face. Like that's probably not what they're thinking, but some people think it's really interesting. And so again, it's about a cultural difference. And the blend. So blend refers to the substrate, essentially. It's what you're blending the chemical composition of vape liquid into. And the two terms you're going to hear about the most are PG and VG, which stand for propylene glycol and vegetable glycerin. Propylene glycol tends to be thinner, have a stronger throat hit. Vegetable glycerin, thicker, sweeter, more vapor. If you want to do vape tricks, you're probably using higher VG stuff. If you're wanting to simulate the feeling of smoking, you're probably going towards heavier PG stuff. And I want to show you what it looks like to buy this, because again, this kind of gives you a feel for this whole industry and market. So here's one place where you can buy it, Vape Wild. And you can see here all the different flavors. And you got like beverage, breakfast, fruit, tobacco, sweets, menthol. But I pulled up the dessert category. And you can see here, like Murica is the red, white, and blue popsicles, strawberry cheesecake. This is that drug that Bradley Cooper used in Limitless. Slow-mo, strawberries and cream, tiramisu, vanilla butternut, sweet complexity. So the Sherbinator, I don't know, pralines and cream, happy demise. No, that's charming. But like you look at this again and you ask yourself, who is this aimed at? Particularly when we know that young people like these sorts of flavors more, and it's kind of clear what's going on here. If we go into strawberries and cream, you can see that you can choose the VG-PG blend ratios and also the nicotine strength, where it is worth mentioning you can get it with zero, but the vast majority of young people who vape do not use zero nicotine vapes. Just kind of the way it goes. And even if they do, there are still a lot of toxins and carcinogens in there, details to be provided in a second. Nicotine is only one of them. There's still a lot of others. Also worth mentioning, here is a place where you can buy Juul-compatible pods. So Juul pulled their flavors, right? But here's a place where you can buy Juul-compatible pods, and they're actually even stronger. This is a 6% one, and if you remember back from the Juul site, they did 3 and 5%. And if we go into it, you can see that they're literally advertising that you stick them in a Juul. So this is part of why, as well, when we're talking about like why do we need the government to step in here? Well, these people know what they're doing. They're angled at kids. And just because Juul pulls their flavors doesn't mean that someone can't go to another site, many of which have fewer age controls, and buy it there. There's other ones, they're called STIGs that are disposable. That's something right now the kids are using a lot. So they're disposable. So like a pack, one of the Juul pods, for example, costs like about $4.25. They come in a 4-pack for $17. So it's also less expensive than smoking. But for $7, you get something that's completely disposable. So like if you want to just flush it down the toilet, for example, if you're about to get caught, it's easier to do that, and it doesn't matter to you. You can just let the things go. So like just confiscating an actual device means a lot less potentially than it used to. So how is it appealing to adolescents? I think we talked about a lot of this, but very easy to conceal the use. So there's no smoke to set off a smoke alarm, very low odor. We hear a lot of complaints from kids who are not vaping that high school bathrooms have like turned into vape shacks, where they walk in and they're just assaulted by it, even if that's not what they want. I feel for schools because there's not many good solutions here. They can't lock down all the bathrooms. They don't have the staff to sit in all the bathrooms. And my idea that we go to retirement communities and get people to volunteer to be bathroom attendants no one's ever taken, I think it could be a really cool way to teach kids how to tip, class things up a little bit and give them some gainful work, but what do I know? Regardless though, there is actually now a vaping detector that you can buy, but they cost a lot. They're $900 each, but you can get them. The issue, of course, still is that even if you install them, what they do is they let you know when it's going on, and you still do have to send someone to go see what's going on. So there's no perfect solution, but there are more solutions that are coming out. But again, the question really comes down to why, right? You can confiscate, you can discipline, but why is this happening in the first place? Why? That's really the crux of the issue. You can use it in the bathroom, discreetly in a classroom. They've got this marketing advantage with flavors over cigarettes right now. Jewels look like a flash drive as well. So history for just a quick second. These were invented in 2003 in China, came over to the US in 2006, but they're generally produced there where very few regulations exist. And that, we'll talk about this on a later slide, but the toxins and carcinogens that are in these things vary wildly depending on what you're using because there's no consistency. What this kind of reminds me of, I don't know if you remember this, but a couple years ago, there was this rash of deaths due to synthetic marijuana, which actually isn't marijuana at all. It's this synthetic cannabinoid. It's like spice and K2. These are things that, like chemicals basically, that people spray on plant matter and call it synthetic marijuana because the chemicals hit your cannabinoids in your brain. But there were like 74 people in Illinois who died from this because what happened was that synthetic marijuana is not a very stable product. Like heroin is heroin. It might be cut with fentanyl or whatever, but like it's heroin. Synthetic marijuana, you have no idea what it is, and so people who made it basically made a bad batch that they mixed with an anticoagulant, with warfarin, and so people bled out of all of their holes, and that's why they were dying. Like, it was really unfortunate, but when we in addiction medicine heard about this, we were like, yeah, we could see this happening, right? Because that's the sort of product that K2 spice synthetic marijuana is. You have no idea what's really going on there. This is kind of the same way. So when you see people dying of a mysterious vaping illness and no one knows why, yeah, sure, right? The FDA is asking to review them and they're getting sued by the industry. Like that's where we are with this right now. Adult use actually is rare and less than cigarettes. Only about 2.5 to 5.5 of adults currently use vape pens, and most of them are current smokers. So they're just kind of alternating between the two. They're not necessarily completely switching off. But what's really concerning right now is what's going on with adolescents. And we're going to go quickly over this slide because there's newer data, but if you look here, you can see that e-cigarettes were going up and up and up. This is up through 2015. That's in high school, and then here's middle school. The most recent data we have from the National Youth Tobacco Survey shows what we've been seeing, and honestly, I think the data that they're going to release in 2020 will be very similar. We saw a 78% increase in high school vaping use in 1 year, between 17 and 18, and a 48% increase in middle school in 1 year. So, like, you see this, and like, you're Altria, and you're like, I got to get into this at $13 billion, right? Because this is great news if you're in the business of addiction. Because look at all these young people getting hooked on this product. Money, money, money. That's what you see here. The problem is that if you care about the health of young people and the trajectory that the nicotine use and dependency puts them on, this is very concerning because ideally, young people, you want them to have the best and healthiest life possible. This moves them away from that. That's why we care, right? We wouldn't care about this if it was completely harmless. It's not. It hurts people. So this is a very disturbing trend if you care about kids. And what's also interesting about this is that for the first time in decades, we saw an increase in tobacco use because we know that kids who vape are more likely to use cigarettes because they're already addicted to the nicotine, and it's a quick switch. So again, this is great if you're Altria, right? This is great if you're Marlboro because not only are you getting in on the trendy new way that kids are consuming nicotine, but you're also bringing them back to your original product line, which has been declining in popularity up until now. So it's like a win-win all around if you're an addiction profiteer. But again, the problem is that many of us are not, like myself included, and we just want our kids to grow up as healthy as possible. So this is a very negative trend. So why do people vape in general? It's perceived as healthier than regular cigarettes. PG and VG-based solutions are viewed as natural. Because technically they are, but there are lots of things that are natural that you shouldn't be breathing, like everything, actually. That's not air. And vapor sounds like water, even though water actually isn't really a part of it at all. So it kind of hits on these words and tropes that are associated with less harm. For smoking cessation, it's easy to change doses, and for adolescents, the flavor is a huge draw, and they feel like it looks cool. and brings you into the social group or identity. The one thing I want to bring up actually with this point, before we move on, is about the principle of perceived risk and how this works in the drug world. So the way drugs work is that the lower the perceived risk of a substance, so the less risky you think it is to use something, the more people tend to use it. Makes sense, right? But this is something that drug companies are very aware of. So when you see all these things like people saying that vaping is harmless, or it's just water vapor and flavoring, or like people say that it's healthier, they'll use the word health. They'll invoke the word health for vaping, which vaping is not healthy by any means stretch of the imagination. That lowers perceived risk, which makes it more likely for someone to start using and then get addicted. You see the same thing with marijuana, right? It's just pot. Isn't it medicine anyway? It's a plant. It's going to be legal on January 1st. How bad can it be? These are all things that the industry loves because it helps them sell their product. And honestly, that most of them aren't anywhere based in fact. And we'll talk more about that in the second half of this presentation. But this is about business. And so when you ask yourself, if you're already kind of wondering like, oh, I didn't know about that. I wonder why I'm hearing different things from my kid. This is why, right? There's people who make money off of public misinformation, and then also people are trying to rationalize and justify their own behavior. That's part of it too, right? No one wants to feel bad about what they're doing. So you grab onto these narratives that it's fine, that it's better, that it's no big deal, because it's a way to explain away any negative things about what you're doing. So it's very intentional. And that's something as well that I want to make very clear to you guys tonight. Like none of this is an accident. So here's what we know about vaping from the science side of things. And what I'm going to tell you now comes straight from the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. And the reason why I draw from that, this is a report, it was about 700 pages long, came out about a year and a half ago. And the reason why I pull from here is that the source of data is super important about this stuff because, again, you're getting lots of things from everywhere. There was a study that just came out in a Danish medical journal, actually, that looked at studies on vaping. And what they found was that that studies that were funded by the vaping industry were 95% more likely to not find any harm from vaping. Surprise, surprise, right? This is exactly what big tobacco did. They funded their own research, which was misleading and in many ways untrue. Same thing's happening again. So we got to be super discerning about it. I put my email on the first slide. Happy to give you my card afterwards if you missed it, because I want to be transparent too. I don't want you to believe me just because I have a degree and I'm standing up here talking to you tonight. There's plenty of people who have both those things and are saying something very different than me. I want you to look at the actual sources if you have doubts, because that's really key when money and industry is involved in this. So what these guys do, they're widely respected non-for-profit, and they aggregate research. And this is a really important bit too, because the way that we consume research in our society right now is deeply flawed. So what happens generally is like a study comes out, and people are like, new study finds such and such and such. And then whoever the principal investigator is like goes on Dr. Oz and Oprah, and then everyone's cooking everything in coconut oil. And then it's like a month later, it's like, well, maybe saturated fat is actually saturated fat, regardless of whether or not it comes from a coconut. And then, the same thing happens with agave and the glycemic index, and I feel like we've been going back and forth on whether or not eggs are going to kill you or save your life, depending on like the decade. So like, it's really important that like you replicate stuff. And what these guys do is they look at all the data, and they also rank it by strength, because a case study, like a small study with 12 mice is very different than like a randomized controlled trial with 20,000 people. So we've got to be really careful and have a lot of scrutiny when we look at this data, because again, this is an area where people stand to make money off of misinformation. So here's what we know. There is conclusive evidence, that's their highest level, that in addition to nicotine, most e-cigarette products contain and emit numerous potentially toxic substances. There's substantial evidence that the aerosol contains metal, which might come either from the liquid, the device itself, or how the device is operated. There's substantial evidence that the chemicals present are capable of causing DNA damage and mutagenesis. And this is really important because DNA damage and mutagenesis is what causes cancer. So people might say, well, do we know that vaping causes cancer? And the answer right now is no, we don't, because they haven't been around long enough, and cancer usually takes a little while. But we do know that vaping causes the thing that causes cancer. So give it some time, right? Pretty safe bet. But in terms of the chemicals that are in there, there was one study out of Berkeley lab. Like, I could throw a bunch of stuff at you, but I'm just going to show you a couple. One study out of Berkeley lab found 31 different toxic chemicals in there. Here's a few of them. You might notice, like formaldehyde, that's the one that we hear a lot from cigarettes. For the young people in the audience, if you haven't dissected a frog yet, that's embalming fluid. And actually, what's interesting about that, where that comes from, where does formaldehyde come from, right? Because you might be saying, well, like, that's not on the label. What do these guys know? So here's what this is about. When you superheat a substance, it oftentimes changes its chemical composition and turns into something else. And formaldehyde actually is a byproduct of heating up propylene glycol. Propylene glycol is the base of just about every vape liquid, at least half of it, including Juuls. So you heat up propylene glycol and it decomposes. And one of the things that it turns into is formaldehyde. This, again, like when you hear young people saying, well, it's just flavoring in water, nicotine salts. Like, what's the big deal? Things break down. Similar study for diacetyl. You might notice that one, that's what's been implicated in popcorn lung, which is a potentially fatal, irreversible lung disease. And it's called popcorn lung, not because your lungs look like popcorn, but because it was first found in workers in microwavable popcorn plants. And they found that where they got this disease from was that these guys are standing around these massive vats of artificial butter flavor, which is being superheated and then poured on popcorn kernels. And so they're breathing in this vape, they're basically vaping butter flavor. And when you superheat butter flavor, diacetyl is one of the things that it breaks down into. So like the flavors break down, the propylene glycol breaks down, the vegetable glycerin breaks down, and you have no idea what's in there in the first place. And that's part of where this is coming from. And I think that young people really don't understand this. Here is 10 of the cancer-causing chemicals in e-cigarette vapor from the Center for Tobacco Control Research and Education. And you can see, like, there's our friend formaldehyde. There's nicotine down there at the bottom. Cadmium, lead, and nickel. There's some of our heavy metals. This stuff is in there. Again, this isn't advertised, right? You put that on the side of a box unless people are going to do it. And you're not hearing it come out of the mouths of young people because you don't want to be thinking about that, right? That's, again, where these narratives, it's easier to grab onto them and hear that it's perfectly safe when Juul comes into your classroom or what you read on a blog, because you don't want to necessarily be worried about what you're doing, and maybe there's social costs for you not to do it in the social circles that you're in, right? So it creates these webs that make it harder to break out, but this is the actual truth. And part of the concern for this, and we'll get there in a second, but has to do with the vaping illness. But there's also conclusive evidence that other than nicotine, again, that the number and type of toxic substances is highly variable, and there's substantial evidence that they are addictive. Now, these are older headlines now, honestly, because this is a currently ongoing epidemic. But people are dying and being hospitalized due to vaping. We actually had the very first vaping death in the world here in Illinois. Last I checked, I think we were up to 4 or 5. I think the death count is around 47 right now, and around 2,400 hospitalized. It seems like it's starting to taper off a little bit. But what was really interesting about this, and it's still ongoing, the CDC actually provides updates every Friday on the death count, the hospitalization count, and what they know. But what was really interesting about this was how wide of exposure it got. Now, you might have heard, which came from the CDC, that the cause of this was vitamin E acetate, which is vitamin E, which is another example of something that's great if you eat it, but can kill you if you inhale it, as many things are. And what's happening is that it goes into your lungs and it causes like oil-based damage. Now, how is that getting in there? Basically, so the vitamin E was an additive to a lot of black market vapes, particularly THC, some nicotine. But basically, when you have a black market cartridge, what would happen a lot is that they would dilute it with a filler, kind of like they do like where you cut cocaine or you'll cut heroin with something. But then you also put something else in there to make it not seem like a low-quality product. Part of what's killing people in the opioid epidemic right now is that additive is fentanyl. And you add fentanyl in, and then it packs that punch. But the problem is that you're a street dealer, and microscopic amounts of fentanyl can kill you. And so then people are dying and overdosing. With THC, what was going on is that vitamin E makes it thicker and more viscous, which makes it seem like higher quality. So they were adding that in to make it seem like a better product. But what's interesting about this is that vitamin E is actually not the only issue here. It's the issue in a lot of it. But we have found that people have gotten sick or died who have used black market cartridges of THC and nicotine, who have only used legal products, including dispensary-provided THC products, which people are now dead from this, which theoretically shouldn't have had this in the first place. There are some people who say that they've never touched a THC cartridge at all. Mayo Clinic published an article about 2 months ago that said that the damage they were seeing in the lungs didn't look like oil-based, but looked like a chemical burn that they called looked like mustard gas, which would not seem to imply vitamin E acetate. So it'll be interesting to see where this goes. One of the things that the CDC has been very clear about is that vitamin E is a chemical of concern, but they've been very clear that it might not be the only thing going on here. And as a result, the CDC and Surgeon General have both said we should not be vaping THC for any reason right now, and we should consider not vaping nicotine either. Because, again, we don't know everything that's causing this. Which, by the way, I think is really, I mean, the fact that this stuff is going on, like this is a teen from Gurnee, it's going to attack your lungs. He was 17 years old, is 17 years old, I don't think he died. 26-year-old from Burlington, Wisconsin. You literally don't know what you're inhaling into your body. What blows my mind is like 2 weeks ago, like 40 people got sick from E. coli from like romaine lettuce. And they were like pulling it all off the shelves, right? Because it's like, you know, listeria or E. coli, like stop immediately. But it's like, people are dying from THC vapes. The Surgeon General is saying don't do it, and we're going to be selling them in January. You know what I mean? Like, it's really interesting sometimes when you look at the dichotomy, or when you look at people, like for these vape bans, or these flavor bans, right? Because we know that they appeal to young people. And the biggest pushback is, well, you're going to put vape shops out of business, and now we're not seeing vape bans go into effect in a lot of places. It's like, yeah, you're selling products that are appealing to minors, and it's like, so like maybe you should have picked a different business. Like this is what, you know, like maybe we should be protecting our youth. But it seems like whenever you see discrepancies like this, right, where lettuce leaves immediately, but we're going like gangbusters with THC in January with no THC caps on concentrates, the answer is usually money. And that's the way the addiction market works a bit differently than health services, et cetera. So hopefully we'll see the death go away soon and the hospitalizations go away soon. But honestly, just the other week, I was doing a presentation down in New Lenox, and a mother came up to me afterwards and said, you know, I'd been thinking about this for a while, but seeing this presentation was what I needed. My 17-year-old daughter is at home right now coughing up blood. I'm going to take her to the hospital tonight, which is kind of like, I'm kind of surprised you haven't done this already, but regardless, it's like they knew that she was vaping, and it's like no one should be coughing up blood, much less a 17-year-old. But like this was 3 weeks ago, so like this is real, this is happening, and particularly now, young people really need to be aware of the implications of vaping. It's not what they think it is. So concerns for children and adolescents specifically, there's conclusive evidence that if you get exposed to this, like dermal contact on your skin, eyes, et cetera, it can actually cause seizures, anoxic brain injuries like not having oxygen to your brain, kind of like a stroke, vomiting, lactic acidosis, conclusive evidence that intentionally or unintentionally drinking it can kill you. This is really concentrated stuff, guys, so you're not supposed to consume it any way other than the small amounts that you take from a vape device. I was talking to an assistant principal maybe like 2 years ago about this, bigger guy in like 6'something", 250, and he said he got like a little bit on his hand when he was confiscating it from a student, and he started having tremors from it. So if you have these around the house, you've got to be really careful, particularly if there's young children. If they get their hands on it, that could be significantly bad. We know that there's substantial evidence as well that it increases the chance that they're going to start using cigarettes, and then they will smoke more when they do because they're already addicted to nicotine. So the only areas of benefit from this is current smokers. So there is actually substantial evidence that under typical conditions of use, exposure to toxic substances is less. So that is actually true, right? You will be getting fewer toxins, the current crisis notwithstanding, because this was published 2 years ago. But you are getting fewer toxins than from cigarettes. That doesn't mean that you're getting no toxins. And another thing that you'll hear a lot is that they're like 95% less bad for you. There's no actual truth to that statement. That has not been verified or supported. We don't know actually how much quote unquote better or less harmful for you it is. And even if we try to put a number on it, there's no regulation, remember? So like, who knows really how bad any one particular combination of fluid and device is? We don't really know. But there is really good evidence that it's not as bad as actual cigarettes. There's also moderate evidence that there's fewer toxins in secondhand vape aerosol than secondhand smoke. So the answer to the question of are there toxins and carcinogens in the vape clouds that kids walk into in bathrooms, the answer is yes, there are. Is it as bad as secondhand smoke? No, but it still has those toxins and carcinogens in it. There's also conclusive evidence. This is basically saying that, again, it's not as bad for you. There's less harm to organ systems, moderate evidence that the dependence is less as well. Again, these things were prior to the current epidemic. Again, right now, no one should switch to vaping, honestly, would be my recommendation. There's also moderate evidence that you can use it for tobacco cessation. This is interesting in general, or nicotine cessation. This is interesting because I've heard varying reports from nicotine users. Like I've talked to a smoker who says, I would never switch to vaping to quit because you can do that everywhere. Like people will carry them around the house, they'll bring them to bed, they'll use them at school. Like with a cigarette, you have to go outside and you have to use one at a time. With these things, like you can just keep going and going and going and going. And what's interesting about that too is in that Reuters article, apparently Juul originally considered putting in like a kill switch so that people couldn't take in too much nicotine in a period of time, but they scrapped it. And they didn't end up putting that in there. What's also interesting about this, one of the biggest pushbacks I've heard about a flavor ban, because there's two separate epidemics going on right now. There's the epidemic of youth use, which indoctrinates kids into nicotine use, puts them on a less healthy path than life, more likely to use cigarettes, cardiovascular health issues, et cetera. And then there's the thing that's killing people. And they overlap, but they're actually separate. And what's interesting about the vaping flavor ban, there's a reasonable criticism, which is that a flavor ban doesn't get at the reason why people are dying. And that's true. But like I'll take it. You know, like that's one of the epidemics, even if the impetus for it is kind of misguided. But the biggest thing that you'll hear is like, we can't do this because it's going to push people back to smoking, and we don't want that. And what's mind-boggling to me about this is like, if you want to stop smoking, like, I've got Zyban for you, I've got Nicorette for you, I've got Chantix for you, I've got cognitive behavioral therapy for you, I've got Wellbutrin for you. Hypnosis actually has good clinical, like it's not like your only choices are a blueberry vape pen and smoking. You know, like that's not the way that this works, but that's the argument that you hear, right? Because that's the only one that they can use, right? They're trying to ally themselves with health. They're trying to say, this is a health and harm reduction because they don't want you to think about all the other options that are FDA approved and that don't necessarily kill you and that don't indoctrinate kids. It's really interesting, again, if you have all of the background to look at what's going on here, but so much of this has to do with money. So we're going to pivot for a second over to cannabis. Hopefully we've got some time left. Yeah, we do. But the takeaway, and again, there will certainly be time at the end for questions. The takeaway for vaping, really the bottom line is that, one, right now, don't do it because you could die. Like, we'll just put that out there. But after that's done, the only people who should be vaping are the people who are already smoking cigarettes. Because if you're already poisoning yourself with cigarettes, you're going to poison yourself less with vapes. That's really the bottom line. You cannot trust what's on the label. They have not been reviewed by the FDA. They are not harmless. When you superheat the chemicals, they turn into different things. There are carcinogens. There are toxins. If you are not already smoking, there's no reason why you should vape. Question? Mm-hmm. Yes. So again, the chances, if you are actually trying to stop your nicotine use, maybe it works. It's just not proven. Yeah, it's kind of the bottom. The question was, maybe when you switch over to vaping, it's not going to really help because you're just going to vape more. Absolutely could be the case. It's really like your results may vary. Maybe for some people it works really well. For some people, like my colleague that I was talking to, she's like never. But yeah, it's nothing. You're oftentimes not going to hear physicians be like, well, you should try vaping. They might. There are fewer toxins in general. Again, current crisis notwithstanding. But it's just dicey. The issue, of course, though, is that most people who are vaping right now, 16 out of 17 people, is a kid who was not smoking previously. And that is really probably why most of you are here tonight and what the biggest issue right now is. We're not as concerned about smokers switching to vaping because that might actually be okay. Current crisis notwithstanding, it's the new users. Yes, question up front. Question is, how are they getting it? I think that there's a lot of ways. So if you're over the age of 21 now in the state, but 18 in others, anyone over that age can buy it and then give it to younger people. You'll see a lot of, and I get to this on a later slide as well, kind of like lower tier drug dealing that goes on in schools where you've got kids who have hookups, again, either older siblings, someone who goes and buys it for them, sells it to them, and then they sell it to their colleagues. Some of these sites don't have that good age verification anyway, so you can just say, yes, I'm 21, and then order it. If you're not getting carded when you walk into a storefront, that's another way to get it. If you have a fake ID, that's another way to get it. So there's a lot of ways that it comes about. All right, so for now, let's go on, but definitely we'll have some time at the end to chat. So let's talk about marijuana. So it is a particularly bad idea for kids, and we could talk, and I do sometimes, literally for 3 hours just about pot, because there is a lot to say, and there's a lot to talk about. But I'm going to focus down and just talk about some of the things that I think are most important to know about young people, because what we're seeing right now across the country, and including in states where it is legalized, as it will be here on January 1st, is that the highest groups of users are between the ages of 12 and 35, with the highest group being like your 17 to 25 range. Like that's probably the greatest. And so there's a lot of particular concerns for people in that age range with the substance, and I think it's important for you guys to know what they are. So the first is that there's an increased risk for addiction. First of all, I've heard so many times that there's some controversy about whether or not marijuana is addictive. There's no controversy. I want to put that to rest right now. Zero controversy about whether or not it's addictive. Straight from the CDC, 1 in 10 adults who uses it develops an addiction, 1 in 6 kids, and 25 to 50% of people who use every day. At Linden Oaks, it is the second most common substance that we treat in rehab for adults behind alcohol, and it is the most common substance that we treat in rehab for adolescents. There is physiological withdrawal. It's not just like, oh, in your head. It's in your body. And we've had documented evidence about this for about 20 years in animal models and humans. It's in the DSM, which is like the psychiatric Bible. It's addictive. Zero question about that. Now, why do I think that people think that there's a controversy? Well, one, because that's what the industry wants you to think, because that lowers perceived risk. But two, there's a couple things about this. Two, I think that people confuse anecdote for evidence. So to give you an example, marijuana is addictive in the same way that alcohol is addictive, not like heroin's addictive. So like heroin or meth, like you can use it a few times and it grabs you. Marijuana's not like that. It's like alcohol, where you use it and maybe you're using it socially, and then you're using it a lot of the time, and then you're using it to cope with problems in your life, and then you're pretty much using it every day. And somewhere along the line, you develop an actual physiological addiction to it. That's how alcohol works, and nobody's confused about the fact that alcoholism is real. It's the exact same thing. But it's still not most people. Just like though for most people in this world who use alcohol will not become addicted to alcohol. Doesn't mean that it's not addictive. Same thing is true for marijuana. So I think that people confuse the fact that they look around and be like, well, that person doesn't have a problem, or this person doesn't, and so therefore no one will. Not the way that it works. And again, I work in drug treatment, so I get to see it with my own eyes. I also have a doctorate in this, so I've studied it, both anecdote in front of me and the science. So truly, no confusion about this. The other part, and we're going to skip ahead for a second, we'll come back to this slide, is that pot is a lot stronger than it used to be. And the more THC, the more addictive it is. So a lot of people don't know that THC content in pot at Woodstock was 3 to 4%. That was Woodstock pot. By 2012, it was up to 12%. The average right now off the street and in dispensaries, to be honest with you, is 21%. And you can buy it up to 30 or 32% THC. So if you take an average joint of today's weed, that is literally like lighting up 7 Woodstock joints at the same time and smoking them. 3 to 21. Like that's today's weed. It's not the same thing. And we know, again, that the more THC, the more consequences. So I think that when older generations are thinking about this, they're kind of looking back on a reputation for marijuana that even as of the 90s wasn't anywhere near this strong. But when the industry got a hold of it, things changed. And the concentrates are on like a whole other tier. Again, like 90, 95% pure THC. It's nuts in terms of what this is doing to people's brains. So I think that when we talk about why do people think it's not addictive and where do these misconceptions come from, I think that plays a large part. Now for kids, one of the other issues here is that your brain is not actually done developing until the age of 25. No offense to you young people in the room, but you are not playing with the same deck of cards that someone over 25 is. It's just the way biology works. The problem is that when you introduce a psychotropic substance to the brain at a young age, it can have a changing effect, which we'll talk more about in a minute. But the part here also that's last to develop is this part in the front, this blue area called the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that's associated with personality, but then also executive function. This is your area where you can plan, think ahead, think abstractly, synthesize a lot of different things. And so if you don't have as well developed of a prefrontal cortex, that means that you're more susceptible to addiction, because addiction is kind of like a tricky thing where in the beginning, the act of doing it isn't, it's actually reinforcing for many people rather than discouraging. So like you use a substance and you're like, oh, that feels pretty good, or I like this. It doesn't happen sometimes takes a while for it to cause harm. And even then, your brain's change so that you think it's not the substance that's causing problems in your life, it's like something else, like your parents who don't understand, or the law that's wrong, or everyone else doesn't and it's fine, so it must be fine for me, or like all of these other things where literally your ability to think is impaired because your reward pathways have changed. So this is why when you look at the CDC stats of 1 in 10 adults develops this addiction and 1 in 6 kids, it's because your prefrontal cortex isn't fully done developing yet. So we talked about the strength. In terms of what does it do to you academically, it has a very clear impact in a negative direction. So we know that in high school it leads to lower grades, higher dropout rates, increased school disciplinary problems. It may be cognitive, and we'll talk about that in a second, but also social functional, or both. And what that means is that if you are smoking pot with your friends, that group of friends is likely not to be the ones staying late at the library on Thursday to study for the history test. Like, you're selecting yourself into a group of people who, on average, are not as likely to achieve as much as those who choose to go a different route. And so when you associate with them and you engage in those behaviors, it pulls you further away from the higher grades. Again, it doesn't mean that all of a sudden now you're going to get like D's when you otherwise would have gotten A's, or even that any one person individually is going to experience any one change. But again, when you talk about social influence, how much time you're spending on one thing versus another, how well you learn when you're high versus when you don't, these things all work together to create an effect. We also know that earlier use leads to worse outcomes and greater frequency use leads to worse outcomes. College, we see largely the same thing, and I need to update this slide. Have you noticed that the only colleges he's applying to are in Washington and Colorado? That's like, let's go to Borders. Or like, I want to buy something from Circuit City. But anyway, increased chance to skip class, lower GPA, potentially longer time to graduate. We see the same things. And this does translate into decreased overall lifetime earning potential. So when we run studies and we ask people, how much pot have you smoked over the course of your life? And how much money have you made over the course of your life? The more pot people smoke tends to be the less money that they make. Now again, that's not like a one-to-one correlation. Like take $50 out of your pocket for every joint you smoke. But again, it's this idea of if you're part of this cadre, if you're part of a group of people who's getting high all the time, maybe like it can be subtle, right? Maybe your GPA is 0.5 lower, or you don't take the internship over the summer because you want to make another choice, or you don't learn a skill because you're spending all this time getting high, which moves you it can be subtle, but there's certain breakpoints where your options are closed, or where you're not as competitive as you used to be in a very competitive world. And again, this is about trajectories and about risk profiles. It's not determinism. This is not about like, if you do this, then this will happen. It's about what risk are you exposing yourself to throughout your developmental years, and what's the impact on how far your star shoots. So I think that's another thing also that people sometimes get confused, is that determinism and risk are very different. But if you want your child to have the best chance at success, you want them to be exposed to the least risk possible. And ideally, they should want that as well if they want to excel as much as they can. Your brain can actually physically change as well. So this is a study looking at different brain structures. And you'll notice there that it says the role of cannabinoids in, and I'm going to pull up my magnifying glass for this, neuroanatomic alterations in cannabis users. So that literally means the shape of your brain changes because you use marijuana when you're young. And this is like literally a brain structure change. This does not grow back. This does not come back. Because your brain is growing and developing until you're 25. It's growing in some places, it's pruning in others. And what they found, so this is a meta-analysis, a lot of different studies. And what you're looking at here is each one of those little bars has a few colors in it and is corresponding to a certain analysis of a different brain structure. If it's gray, that means that the study didn't look at the brain structure. If it's blue, it means that it looked at it but found no effect of marijuana on the brain development. But if it's red, it means that it looked at it and found a structural change in this top row by dosage. So that means the higher the THC content that a kid is using, the greater the chances that you're going to see a structural change in the brain in this area. And again, remember, today's pot is 7 times stronger than it used to be, and the dabbing, which is so popular, and can be put into vape devices, is off the charts. The hippocampus, I want to show you guys I want to point out a couple here. The hippocampus right there, that's the one there. 85% of studies found a structural change in the hippocampus by dosage. This is the part of your brain that's associated with learning and memory development. The other one that has the most impact, PFC, prefrontal cortex. Again, executive functioning and personality. Down here, the second row is looking at duration. So this means doesn't matter how strong it is, just how long are you smoking. And here, look at those two. Those are the only two that they found an effect again. Hippocampus, about maybe 20%, and prefrontal cortex, about 15%. So again, it doesn't even matter what you're using, just that you're using it for a long period of time changes the structure of your brain potentially. To me, that's really serious. There's many pet peeves that I have about January's law, but one of them is that we are selling it to 21 and up, despite the fact that we know that the brain isn't done developing until 25, and that the prefrontal cortex, which is one of the areas most affected by this, is one of the most affected areas. Modeling, that was another thing, like modeling the recreational marijuana law after alcohol is like, to be perfectly frank with you, for public health and safety, alcohol policy has been a disaster. It's associated with like half of all car accidents, half of all batteries, half of all rapes, kills 88,000 people a year. 3 times as many people in this country are addicted to alcohol than everything else combined. So saying like, yeah, let's do that again. Maybe we could do better. But here we go. So in terms of brain aging, this is another area. So now it's kind of like turnabout's fair play. For all of us over 28 in the room, our brains are dying every day. Sorry, we're all in the sinking ship together. It's where we're at. But there are things that can either speed up brain decay or slow it down. And what they actually found was that cannabis misuse, we don't like to use the word abuse anymore actually, 2.8 years off your brain life, second only to schizophrenia in terms of aging patterns. Alcohol, by the way, was only 0.6. That's another thing you'll hear people say, well, at least they're not drinking, or at least it's not alcohol. Marijuana is actually worse for the developing brain than alcohol is. Not to say that alcohol is any better, because that's like apples and oranges in a way, but this is actually the worser one. So say it's actually changing the shape of your brain. What's the impact of that? Here's a longitudinal study looking at cognitive abilities over time of marijuana users. And this graph is looking at 4 different areas of cognitive ability. Working memory, so short-term memory, nonverbal reasoning, long-term memory, and inhibitory control, so your ability to control your marijuana use. You'll notice here that for each of these graphs, the blue and the red are on opposite sides of the graph. The blue is no marijuana. The top one is most marijuana. And if the blue's on the bottom, that's where you want it to be. If the blue's on the top, that's where you want it to be. So it's pretty consistent. Everything is just, there's something taken off the top. It's not like the graph drops off, but you can clearly see there's an impact here across a number of different domains of cognitive function if you've got a young person using this over time. We know that it leads to increased risky sexual behavior when young people are high, and then also psychotic breaks. And this is something, I really want to make sure we take a second to talk about this, because this is something that oftentimes gets misconstrued. So something that I'll hear a lot when I'm talking about this is people will be like, reefer madness. Like if you say anything bad about cannabis, that means that like you're based in the 50s and it has no merit. It's like, no, this is actual real research. But there was an overreaction once. Now this is science. And what we know is that marijuana is associated with having psychotic breaks. At Linden Oaks, 2 kids at any point in time are in my hospital for a marijuana-induced psychotic break. Sometimes they go away, sometimes they don't. Seriously, I've had people come up to me after talks and be like, my daughter had this, will it ever go away? And I always ask, how long has it been? Because for the most part, if it's been more than 2 weeks, they're stuck that way. And you would be very surprised at how often this happens. It's not everyone, of course, right? That would be ridiculous. Like people would be dropping like flies, but 2 people at any point in time in a 40-bed adolescent unit have this problem. It is not rare. Just ask any psychiatric hospital about it. Very common. It increases with higher percentage of THC. So this study made national news back in March. It was published in Lancet Psychiatry, which is one of the most prestigious medical journals we have. They were looking at this link between marijuana and first episode psychosis in 11 different cities in Europe. And what they found was that 12% of all cases of schizophrenia could have been prevented across 11 cities in Europe if not for THC. 30% in London, 50% in Amsterdam. And what they found was that if you're using flower-based marijuana, your chances of a psychotic break go up by 50%. And if you're using these concentrates, it goes up by 500%. 5 times. I was at a school, third week of school, I was at a school in Plainfield giving a presentation much like this one. And their principal told me that they'd actually hospitalized 3 of their students in the first 3 weeks for marijuana-related psychotic breaks. This is not as rare as people think it is, particularly when you are dabbing. Hopefully that trend did not continue, but first 3 weeks, that was what they saw. The other one that made national news 5 days later was that in Colorado, after legalization, they found that ED visits related to THC they tripled. And the 2 reasons for this were psychotic breaks, and then also something called cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, which is something that, again, a lot of people haven't heard about, but I was literally in an emergency department strategic meeting at Edward Hospital, which is part of my network, 2 days ago, where we had a long discussion about the fact that we already see this. Like, ED physicians, they know about this, just ask them. And they're wondering, how do we prepare for the fact that this is going to triple come January 1st if Colorado statistics hold? What this is, cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, or CHS for short, is when someone cannot stop vomiting and have a very extreme abdominal pain. And so basically what happens is that they're screaming, they're just retching and vomiting because they're not trying to actually purge anything from their bodies. They're just literally retching and they can't stop. And so usually what you'll do is you'll hook someone up to an IV for fluids, put them in the back because they're literally screaming and vomiting and it disturbs other patients. And there's no way that we found to get them to stop. Warming the core, so like putting heating pads on the core seems to help a little bit, like warm shower if you've got one, but most emergency departments don't. But it's really serious, and actually I got this stuff from USA Today. A 17-year-old died from this back in September. He literally vomited himself to death. This is another thing you'll hear, no one's ever died from weed. Absolutely they've died from weed. There was a study that came out in forensic toxicology that found that it was one of the causes of death in 222 different cases that were reported to poison control. And actually the single substance, when you do postmortem autopsies in 8 of them, THC alone kills somebody. Is that anything close to opioids? No. But has it killed people? Absolutely it's killed people. And that doesn't count things like people burning their house down, trying to dab with a butane torch, getting in a car accident, which absolutely happens more when you legalize, et cetera, et cetera. It absolutely kills people. And so this is, again, just another one of these examples of things that people use to lower perceived risk. Because the lower the perceived risk, the greater the chance that you're going to use it. But truly, like, this thing is, well, people are sometimes surprised by this. Literally, like, the emergency room physician was going over her protocol that she already has for CHS, and she's like, none of the kids believe that this is what it is. I guess down in Plainfield, we've got an ED in Plainfield, Edward does. I guess there's 2 people about 25 years old who come in like every weekend vomiting uncontrollably with this. And they never listen that like this is what's going on. So something to look forward to in January if you're in the healthcare industry. And then drug driving. So it is not safe to drive high. And this is something else that a lot of people don't understand. When you are high, your ability to judge your speed decreases. Your lateral control of a vehicle decreases. Your ability to see everything on the road decreases, and your processing speed decreases. All of these things are important for driving, and it absolutely makes a difference on the road. We could talk a lot about this on its own, but just very quickly, this is number of finger to nose misses in a case from people who were pulled over. The median was 0 for a control sample, and 5 for people who had any THC in their blood whatsoever. Big issue with this as well is no one knows when you're quote-unquote too high to drive, because actually even this, people say 5 nanograms per liter of blood is like the 0.08 of THC. It means nothing. This actually is statistical speak for it didn't matter if it was over or under 5 nanograms of THC in the blood. This is because THC is very lipophilic. It's attracted to fat. Your brain is 70% fat. So unlike with alcohol, where it stays in your blood and the amount of alcohol in your blood is a reasonable facsimile for your impairment, THC goes out of your blood and into your brain, and then where you can't detect it, but it still affects you. And then we all actually metabolize it differently. So different people will become less impaired faster than others. There have been some studies that actually find that people are impaired in their ability, in their motor functions, up to 24 hours after consuming THC products. So I don't have to tell this to any of the law enforcement professionals in the room. They all know. That's why they were very concerned, and the state chiefs of police were against doing this. But it's important for, I think, people who are considering using this also to know that it lasts. And we've got to be very careful if you're going to use THC and then drive, operate heavy machinery, parent. You might not actually be fully right for a long time. And a gateway drug. I want to make sure we touch on this too. So this is another thing where people say that there's a myth about this. Again, in the addiction world, we know that this is not a myth, and I want to explain to you why this is. So this is data from national level survey, the NISDA survey from the government. And what you're looking at here, the only difference between the orange lines and the blue lines are marijuana use for a 12 to 17-year-old individual. You can see here for illicit drug other than marijuana use, it's literally 10 times higher. This is a study that looked at the chances that you are going to develop a new addiction to prescription opioids within 3 years if you use recreational marijuana. This was between 2001 and 2005. And they found that occasional use increased your chances by 5, and frequent use increased it by 8. This, by the way, is what a time bomb looks like in the middle of an opioid epidemic. So there's also that. 92% of people who use heroin have used marijuana first by this national level data. Now, here's what a gateway drug is and what we mean by this. It means that 92% of people who use heroin use marijuana first. It does not mean that most people who smoke marijuana will use heroin. And I think that's where people get confused about what a gateway drug means. Let me explain to you how this works. So people will also say things like correlation does not equal causation, which is absolutely true. And sometimes in the lack of actual data and causational level studies, we have to make some inferences that are based on solid reasoning. So here's what I mean by this. We don't know that cigarettes cause cancer because we haven't had a study where 30,000 people chain smoked for 50 years and another 30,000 people didn't, and we looked to see who's got cancer and who's dead at the end of it. We didn't do that. Instead, what we have is one, really strong correlational data that smoking is associated with throat, mouth and lung cancer, and a mechanism of action, which is DNA mutagenesis. We know that cigarettes cause the thing that cause cancer, and we've seen this really strong correlational link over time. Ergo, cigarettes cause cancer, and everybody knows it. So here's what we've got for THC and marijuana. We've got the strong correlational data for decades, irrefutable, everybody knows it. The mechanism of action for addiction is a little bit different because it's not just a biological problem. It is a biopsychosocial problem. A biological problem, a psychological problem, and a social problem. And the mechanism of action looks a little bit different. Because here's the way it works. If someone walks up to, say, like a young kid, like say a friend walks up and says, hey, friend who's never used a drug in your life, here's a bag of heroin. You want to tie off and inject it? They're going to be like, no, I'm not. Because, again, if we go back to perceived risk, that's really high up on the perceived risk ladder, right? Really high up there. Nobody starts with heroin. 0 people start with heroin. What happens instead is, say you've got a kid, maybe they're vaping, maybe they're not, but at some point someone shows up with a THC pod, or like THC wax, shatter, or like marijuana flower, and it's a friend, and they're like, you should do this, like we're all doing it, and they're thinking like, well, it's just a plant, it's going to be legal in January anyway, isn't it a medicine? And so they're like, okay, I'm going to do it. And now you're using THC for fun to get high, maybe even eventually to cope, and you're hanging out with people who do this for fun, which, by the way, is not everybody. It actually is not everybody in high school, and it's not even everybody in college. But sometimes I think that people look at their own social network and think everybody's doing it, when that's not the case. But now they're doing that, and when you select yourself into that group of people, you are more likely to come in contact with cocaine, with someone who brings to a party, or a hallucinogen, or a Norco, or a bar of Xanax. But maybe it's a Norco, right? Or maybe someone brings a Percocet to a party, and you try that, and you really like that, because opioids produce this really strong sense of euphoria. But they also grab you fast, and so now you're hooked on pills. And you're buying pills, but pills cost a lot, because they're safer than heroin, because they're made by pharmacy and safer. So heroin's cheaper. So eventually you get heroin off the street, but you snort that, because that's lower perceived risk than injecting. But then eventually you inject it because the snorting isn't working for you anymore. And then you're injecting heroin. And I can tell you this story because I've heard it over and over and over. I run drug treatment centers for a living, guys. Adults and kids, over and over and over again. Nobody starts with heroin. Because here's the deal, like if heroin is like step 5, you have to start with step 1, and step 2, and step 3, and step 4. Just because you get to step 1 doesn't mean that you're getting to step 5. But if you never take step 1, you will not get to step 5. And that's what it means to be a gateway drug. There is no debate about this. There's no lack of understanding about this. I think there's a lack of understanding of what a gateway drug means. But that's what it actually means. If you do not start, you will not finish. And so again, this is about risk profile. This is about the question of what risks are young people being exposed to, and what does that mean for the chances that they're going to end up in one of my clinics down the line for marijuana or something else. That's why I'm standing here tonight. It's worth mentioning, I've talked a lot about industry. I speak about these things against my own financial interest, because the more people addicted to marijuana, the more money I make. Like seriously, like I'm here because this is my own sense of ethics, not because it's going to be good for me in any like monetary, like this, that's why I do these things. So in terms of target demographic, I want to talk about what the marijuana industry does. I mentioned that 90% of addictions start in adolescence. Here's what we're seeing out of Colorado. You know, again, like you look at the lollipops, you look at all these things, and you ask yourself again, who's this marketed at? And it's not like a 52-year-old pre-diabetic. But we're going to see a lot of this come January 1st. These will not happen because we can't directly mimic and like riff off of existing products, but this totally can. We'll probably see this sort of stuff, as long as it's not directly mimicking something. But I want to show you guys, because I think that there's a lot of misunderstanding here. Quick show of hands. How many of you have actually been to, right now in Illinois, have been to a medical marijuana dispensary or perused their website? Quick show of hands. A couple people. All right, so for the rest of you, I think this is really instructive to actually see what's going on here and what's been going on here for years and why we are where we are right now. So let's take a trip over to the Compassionate Care Center in Naperville. This is right next to where I work. And just look at the names of these products with me. I'm going to make them bigger for you here. But here's what they're selling and calling medicine. 707 Headband, Blue Cheese, Durban Poison, Flow, Bio Jesus, Ghost Train Haze, Sweet Island Skunk, Gumbo, Kosher Kush, Howie Wowie, Strawberry Cough. Who knows what OG stands for? Shout it out. Original Gangster. So here's the thing. This isn't marketed at 65-year-old women with MS. You know what I'm saying? It's just not. Here it actually even says like it was the winner of the High Times Cannabis Cup in 09 and 010, and it didn't win that because it was so good for glaucoma, right? So here's the thing. Marketing is always on purpose. I learned embarrassingly late in life that goldfish crackers aren't just like born that way, but they're shaped that way because kids like them. And same thing with animal crackers, right? When they're shaped like animals, you can bite off their heads systematically. Or maybe that's just me. But like that's on purpose, right? That's marketing. You could call this anything. You wouldn't know what Advil was unless somebody told you. You wouldn't know what Tylenol was unless somebody told you. Mucinex maybe like a little bit. You don't have to do this. This is on purpose. It's also worth mentioning, I was blown away when I saw this for the first time. This is on their concentrate. So they're selling these really high potency things, even though, again, there's like zero evidence that high potency THC vapes and like waxes and shatter are actually good for any medical condition. But I want to show this to you because it blew my mind. And actually, I should also mention, I presented this to a city council in front of the owner of this dispensary. And he did not take it down. I've literally, like, I pulled this up this morning, right? So, like, clearly he has no problem with this. But I want to, oh my gosh. He did, oh, no, he didn't. It's still here. I thought he took it down for a second. So, RSO Purple Urkel. Here's what it says. I want to read this for you. The term Rick Simpson oil, RSO, refers to extremely potent decarboxylated extracts produced from strong sedative indica strains, which have THC levels in the 90% range. This harmless, non-addictive, natural medication can be used with great success to cure or control cancer, MS, pain, diabetes, arthritis, asthma, infections, inflammations, blood pressure, depression, sleeping problems, and just about any other medical issues that one can imagine. This, guys, is why we have the FDA. Because people walk into these places and they have no idea what to buy, truly. They have no idea, they can buy whatever they want. Your physician doesn't give you like a prescription. You buy what you want, and dispensary employees direct you towards a product. And this is the sort of thing that they put on their website, and when I even call them out in front of them, they don't take it down. This is what's actually going on. Here's a product that they're selling right now. I pulled it up. Green crack. THC, 80%. And I should mention here, that, again, like I don't know many medications called green crack that, you know, that you buy in Walgreens. But like there's no difference between medical marijuana and recreational marijuana, just like there's no difference between like recreational Percocet and fun Percocet. Like this is all the same stuff. And this is what's going to be sold to the general public in under a month. They're going to be buying green crack, which again is something that the Surgeon General said we shouldn't be doing anyway because people are dying. So this is the industry, and this is how it's always been marketed. And again, didn't have to be this way. This is on purpose. Here is an example of an edible. Here's a 500 milligrams, which is a huge amount, by the way, of THC Rice Krispie treat that is literally made out of, if we make it bigger, it's literally made out of Fruity Pebbles, Cocoa Pebbles, Captain Crunch, and Trix. We know that Trix isn't for silly rabbits. Here is Native Roots in Colorado. So this is a recreational dispensary. This is the biggest chain they have there. And if you look down at what they've got, Fruit Snacks, Stardot, Jack Flash, Alien OG. We've got Flow. We've got Flow. The Rook, Pineapple Express. Like if you look at this and you ask yourself, is our medical industry, does that look more like this? Or does it look, Durban Poison, we've got that one too. Or does it look more like Native Roots? The answer is this, because this is what it's always been. This has been what it's always been angling at. And we could spend a long time talking about the medical marijuana industry and what's going on there, because that's a whole nother topic. But the bottom line is that this is where things are pointed. And this is not pointed at the older crowd. Because again, if you are in the industry of addiction profiteering, you target the young. Because that's where you hook people. They are more susceptible to it. It's where the profits are. And it's really important to understand that anyone with a fake ID can buy this on the 20, in about 3 weeks coming. And actually, quick factoid, interesting about this. Guess who has exclusive rights to sell to the state of Illinois come January 1st? The medical dispensaries. They actually didn't let anyone else into the market on purpose. That was how it was negotiated. They were the ones lobbying for this. And also interesting note, because this was supposed to be about social justice, guess how many of the 11 dispensaries that are allowed to sell on January 1st are owned by anyone from any minority? 0. Not a single one. So we could talk about this for a long time, but we're going to move on for now. But it's worth knowing that that's what's going on here right now. 1 in 4 12th graders said that they would either try marijuana or use more if it was legalized in their state. This is out of Monitoring the Future. And actually, there was just a study published in JAMA Psychiatry, another highly reputable journal, that found that states with a legalization policy, the youth growth rate in those states is 25% higher in those that don't. So again, when you normalize use, when you encourage it, we've allowed for marijuana advertising in our state, what do you expect will happen? But it's what we as adults, if we don't want the ramifications coming to we have to be proactive and we have to have conversations about this. We found also that that young people who vape are 3.5 times higher, more likely to start using THC. Because again, this is the way it works, right? Very easy. You can just Google like how to put THC in a Juul pod, find out how to do it. You know, it's a very quick jump. And again, these concentrates are the ones that are associated with the most harm. So I'm noticing that the time is 8:01. I'm going to keep talking, but if anyone wants to go, I will not be offended. We have one last section to talk about what can you do as a parent, and then I'll be happy to take some questions. But I apologize for those who are planning on leaving at 8. Just have a little bit more to go. So what can you do? The number one thing is stay connected and know the signs. So basically, if you are not well connected to your kid and their world, then you will not know when things change and get different. And that is one of the most crucial things, is that stay in touch with your kid's life, and then you'll know when things change. So what should you be looking for? The first thing to watch for is school functioning. So truancy, missed appointments and homework, having fewer extracurriculars. Their peer group, their old friends might start fading away if they had friends who weren't into these activities, and they might say they have new friends, but you've never met these folks. They might not be bringing them home. On social media, what are they following? What are they posting? If you are not on your child's social media, by the way, you should fix that immediately. They do not own those devices. They do not own those services. As parents, it is your job to help protect them until they are no longer your charge, and there are tremendous dangers on the internet for young people. Like, that is in itself another 2 hours that we could talk about. But you get privacy when you're 18 for those things. And that doesn't stop. You know, like, young people, I'm sure you know about Finstagrams, right? Your real one that you show your parents and then your fake ones. Nothing's perfect, but you would be very surprised at what young people are putting just completely out in the open if you just take the time to look. In terms of family dynamics, strained relationships and avoidance. Moody, they might be breaking their curfew. Part of what you need to look for with addiction is that any one of these things might happen for other reasons. Like, say a kid, your child is developing an emotional problem. They might struggle at school, but their friends probably won't necessarily change, and the family dynamics might be more secondary to that. Oftentimes, if you have an addiction problem, multiple areas or all of them start to change. And then you also see changes in personal habits and hygiene. So things to notice: a decline in hygiene in general, burns on fingers or lips, dilated or red eyes, long sleeves in warm weather, which can either be used for, again, concealing vaping or, in the case of heroin, track marks. Wardrobe changes. Young people communicate with their clothes. It's one of their main methods of self-expression. So if you started to see changes in the way your young person dresses that seem to be moving them towards a different culture or subculture, that's intentional on their part. They're trying to communicate things and fit in with peers. Money irregularities, either too little or too much. They have to buy it somehow, or if they're dealing, they'll start having items that are more expensive, or they'll seem to have more money on them than they should. A lot more kids are dealing than parents think that there are. Secretive phone calls, going to the bathroom a lot also is potentially a sign of vaping, because that's where they'll go to use and conceal it, both at school or at home. Changes in sleep habits or energy, munchies or sudden appetite, unusual smells or overuse of scents and gum and mouthwash, as if they're trying to conceal another sort of odor. So for substance use, again, multiple areas generally are impacted. Concealing it also takes a lot of time, and it's got to come from somewhere. So you've got to obtain it, you've got to use it, and potentially you've got to recover from using it. And so if someone is structured in their time, it's got to come out of somewhere, out of an extracurricular, out of school, when they should be home. And this is, again, if your child is engaged in things and you're connected, it's a lot easier for you to notice these changes. If you know what normal looks like, you'll know when normal changes. So stay connected. Provide pro-social activities and peer groups for your children to identify with. So one of the biggest reasons why young people fall into this is that it makes them part of something and part of a peer group that they want to fit into. If they have a different peer group that's not doing those things that they value, that they feel connected to, they're much less likely to do this. Nothing's a fail-safe. There's a lot of drug-related pitfalls that young people have to navigate right now. Nothing's perfect, but if they're engaged in something where this is basically running counterproductive, or where vaping or using drugs would be antithetical to what they're trying to achieve, they're less likely to be doing it. Reward positive behavior, and this part's really huge. So oftentimes when parents are frustrated with their child's behavior, there's just a lot of leaning on the punishment, like grounding, taking things away. But it doesn't get at the source, right? Why is this happening in the first place? Is it that they feel like this is the only social network that they can get into, that they care about? Are they dealing with an emotional problem and coping with it in that way? Behavior always serves a function, even when it seems counterproductive. They wouldn't be doing it if they weren't getting something out of it. That goes for anyone of any age, for anything. So you've got to try to really figure out what's going on there and not just try to beat it out of someone, because they're going to grow up, right? And they're going to leave. And then they're just going to go right back to it if you don't actually solve the problem. But the other part of it is that you have to reward positive behavior. So a lot of times, like, the negative stuff is like this big glaring flashing sign in front of you, but when they actually come home on time, or they talk with you and share what's going on, or they get a good grade on something, really taking the time to recognize that and celebrate that is crucial, because that's just as important, if not more so, in shaping behavior than any form of punishment. And we've learned that slowly over time, but providing those positive incentives for pro-social healthy behavior is critical. It's not just about the punishment, because that can, you push, that allows for pushback. So that's, again, a much longer topic there in terms of parental coaching, but that's some of the basics. Have access to phones and mobile devices. Again, cannot stress this enough. Some stuff is just right there if you take the time to look. And the last thing is consider home drug testing. And this is actually something that might sound kind of like controversial or counterproductive, but it's actually, I was talking to a pediatrician recently who's like, oh yeah, I do that with my son or daughter all the time. And, or not all the time, but I do it randomly once a month. Not because I don't trust them, but because it gives them an out. Because that way, if they're put in a situation where they have to refuse or use, they can say, my dad is crazy. He checks my urine every month and I never know when, I can't do it. And it provides a way out, actually, in a potentially difficult situation. It also means, again, I mean no offense to anyone in the room, every parent, when their child first starts having a drug problem, is totally surprised by this. They have no idea that it was going on in the first place. They never thought that their son or daughter would hide this from them. They thought they had a really close relationship. It doesn't mean that you don't. I'm not, like, no offense meant, but that's the way that it always starts. You think that you know, but you really don't know. So biomarkers generally don't lie, particularly if they're unexpected and they're not like carrying urine around with them, which happens a lot more in drug treatment centers than it does at home. So consider this. You can buy a lot of really good ones on Amazon. They're not expensive. You can get them for THC. You can get them for nicotine and cotinine. Cotinine is a metabolite of nicotine. So consider it. Again, it's kind of like in the medical world. We started doing drug testing now for anyone on opioids. It's standard practice at Edward Elmhurst Health, not because we're trying to tell people that we don't trust them, but some people have trouble with their meds. And if they're having trouble with their meds, we want to know so that they don't end up dead, because that's part of the environment that we're in. Young people, many of them are fine, but a lot of them fall into these traps. They don't feel comfortable talking to their parents. They don't have an easy way to say no. This helps with all of that. So something to consider. Another thing, you can Google this or scan it, but Stand Strong Coalition created a parent toolkit, which I think is fantastic. I've read it. It talks about everything that I just mentioned tonight and a bunch more. So check this out if you have a moment. Again, you don't have to have a QR code scanner on you right now to download this. Just Google it, but absolutely worth looking at. So to sum up, and then happy to take some questions, vaping and marijuana are both chronically misunderstood, and this isn't an accident. We've talked about a lot tonight. I've shown you websites. We've talked about data. Like, this is all intentional. The vaping epidemic amongst youth is on purpose. The fact that the FDA hasn't reviewed it yet, there's a reason for that. And it's not because, honestly, they haven't wanted to for a while. This is about money. And there's very rich people who are trying to get more rich at the expense of our society, and particularly our young people. And again, we could talk even longer about what happened in Illinois that's leading to January 1st. Let's just say the State Medical Society put out a lot of recommendations that if you're going to do this, here's what you should do. Virtually none of them made it into the law because most of them run counterproductive to profits. Things like THC caps, for example, or not selling it to anyone under 25. That cuts out a portion of the market, right? So we could talk a lot more about this, but this is not about health. These are industries that are trying to make money. From a health perspective, no one should vape if they aren't already smoking cigarettes. And again, right now, no one should be vaping, in my opinion, at all until the CDC isn't updating the death count every Friday. Marijuana is far from a benign substance and is particularly harmful for youth. If you like the brain, I can't stress that enough, the brain is not done developing and it has a significant and potentially permanent impact on how that develops. And these THC extracts can be vaped, and again, this is the highest potency product associated most strongly with psychotic breaks, addiction, brain damage, all of it. These are the ones that are easiest for young people to use in vaping devices. It's a really unfortunate cross. And as a parent, stay connected with your kid. Most important step that you can take. So thank you so much for your time and attention tonight. And I'm happy to take some questions. Yes? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so folks on the site, this was a question about what are we doing to educate kids in the school district? Could one of you guys comment on that?
Thank you. So the question, what are we doing in schools? We do have a drug campaign, anti-drug campaign, I should say, that we talk about. We do have our own drug and alcohol counselor. Miss Barbara Belke is a certified drug and alcohol abuse counselor. Did I say that right? And so when our students are caught with vapes or marijuana or under the influence of any substance, discipline is not generally our first step unless you are distributing it. Then that's a different problem. And so we have intervention classes that Barbara and other student service members teach and kids are required to go so they can learn and better understand some of the things that Dr. Weiner was talking about. You know, it is part of our health education unit, and it is part embedded in some of our PE courses as well. We have a lot of campaigns going on. We're trying to get more of a grassroots effort from our kids, because we can say it all day long, and there's posters and there's all this information up in the bathroom stalls and everywhere you look. But we also know that kids learn best from other kids. And so we are working on advisory councils with students and things like that to help spread that kind of word. And we are also very fortunate to have our SRO in our high school, Detective Fry. Woo. And so he helps to work with our kids as well. But I'll be honest, a lot of it is reactionary. And I don't know, how many vapes do you think we collect a day? Yeah, you know, like it's a lot, and I can tell you, since I've been here, it has increased what we've been confiscating in middle schools. So when parents ask, well, how did they do this? I'll tell you, they go and, you know, a lot of kids, how many of your kids have a debit card that's just assigned to them to teach them, you know, allowance and financial management? Well, these things are really cheap. So what I tell parents, if you get a package at your house and your child is not 18, like, you should open that package, because you can get them off Amazon. You can buy them anywhere. And if you ask a kid where they got it, they'll say they bought it. And maybe it's not your credit card. Sometimes it is, if you don't know what to look for in the, you know, in the subject area of what the company is, you might not know either. Or someone else's friend buys it, and everyone gives them $5, and then they buy a case or whatever. So if you get a little box in the mail and you didn't, and your child ordered it and you didn't order it, you know, I would look at it. Chances are there's something in there. If your child's room smells like cotton candy all the time, chances are somebody's vaping in there.
Or they got a cotton candy machine. Come on.
Right. Or a peach tree grew in their, you know, in your backyard. Sure. We do that for our prom assembly, right? I know. Right. And they often go into specific classrooms. Like, we wouldn't have a whole assembly with a 19-year-old kid. You know, we like to make those more intimate, where the kids can participate more. We have had parents in the past of students who have, you know, been addicted, and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So CBD is cannabidiol, and is the other main cannabinoid that we hear coming out of cannabis plants. It's worth mentioning that marijuana is very high in THC and very low in CBD generally. Hemp is very high in CBD and very low in THC. So most of the time, like, when people say, like, I need CBD, so I need a marijuana, like a medical card, that's not the case. Most of that is high THC stuff. Now, CBD is not psychoactive. It is not addictive. Generally speaking, it's not too much to worry about. Reports of what it does are vastly inflated. There are some early indicators that it's an anti-inflammatory, that it might help with conditions that involve that. So as an example, like, actually there is a pharmaceutical called Epidiolex, which just got through FDA trials, and you can now get at the pharmacy, that is plant-derived CBD for seizures. Because pot isn't good for seizures, CBD is good for seizures. And so you can get that from, like, a Walgreens and not from a dispensary, because it's a pharmaceutical. But the deal with CBD right now is that at worst it's a placebo and isn't going to do anything. At best, maybe it helps, but, like, do you like rub it on your skin? Do you eat it? I don't know. Like, we don't have data for that. Probably not going to hurt you. The issue, though, is that a lot of it is impure, and it's also not very well regulated. So we'll oftentimes see either contaminants, THC or otherwise, in CBD products, or there's not as much CBD in there as there's supposed to be. There's some people who have come through my programs who say that they're not using THC products, and we have every reason to believe them, but they say they are using CBD products, and they keep coming up positive for THC, and that's usually, like, the easy assumption there is that they're using a tainted product, because it's not well regulated. So that said, at the end of the day, I'm not too concerned about CBD. It's not a miracle drug. If you take it and it helps you, maybe it's actually helping you, maybe it's placebo, but you feel better, so okay. That's kind of the way that I look at it. Yes? Mm-hmm. It comes in a few different forms. Like, I encourage you to just Google it. Like, look for THC extract, but use terms like wax, shatter, butter, Rick Simpson oil, and just do like a Google image search. Sometimes they look like more like glass shards. Sometimes you saw like the waxy, kind of gooey substance. Sometimes they look a little bit more like almost like a nut butter of a sort. Like, they come in a lot of different forms, but do an image search would be my recommendation there. They don't look at all like a flower anymore. Like that cartridge green crack that I showed you, that's an extract. Yeah. Yes, in the back. Thank you.
So this
Yeah.
presentation is going to be on our website, and it's been recorded as well. And so that will also be on our website, Ms. Malik? Yes. So these will all be available on the district website.
Mm-hmm. And hopefully, if the slides aren't posted, which you are welcome to do, you can also email me, and I'll be happy to send you my slides. The slides will be posted. Yeah, my pleasure. So I do assemblies, although I tend to skew it a little bit differently, because what I found is that you talk to young people with like science, and they'll be like, you don't know what you're talking about. So instead what I do is we talk about science, but I also pair it with a lot more talking about how the industry is marketing to children, because you tell a young person that they're getting manipulated by an adult, and that's like, you know, like death, hospitalization, not gonna happen to me, but someone's like using me for money. That tends to get more of a rise out of people who are in a position to be influenced. So I do them. I know other people who do them too. Slightly different slide deck, but I don't know if any assemblies are planned or what's going on with that. But yeah.
We look at that again. We have learned that getting large groups of kids together for one speaker is not the best way to engage kids and have an open dialogue and a conversation. And so we look for other ways to do that. And
Yeah, I just wanted to add to both of your questions before about students. So, right, we definitely look at that, and we know that that's not the best way to reach them. I don't know if you heard before, we said that we are involved with a campaign through the Lake County Health Department, actually 3 communities, Lake Zurich, Wakanda, and Barrington, because, you know, we did recognize through our data that E-cig use was on the rise, and so we really wanted to try to be a little bit more proactive. So with that campaign are the posters that Susan was talking about, where we're looking at, you know, trying to reduce students' perception and risk of harm. We want to, you know, increase risk of harm and decrease their perception that it's something fun. So we really have been working at middle school and high school levels with that, and part of that poster design really comes from our students. We use our students to design, pick out the information, the colors, the font, everything, and the messaging, so that it is really coming from them rather than us saying, this is what you should know. They're telling us, you know, what they want to know and how to present it to the rest of youth. So we really do take a look at that. I think that was it.
Something else that I forgot to put this up, but so the Truth Initiative, who did that study that was looking at Juul use, actually has designed a pretty cool text message program called This Is Quitting. So you text Ditch Juul to that number, and it's down here too, or you can just put it in here. But it's actually a really cool program. I signed up for it, and what it does is it tailors the slang to the age group. So you like say what age you are, and then it tailors the slang. but it basically gives you a lot of supportive messages for, like, if you actually want to stop vaping, it gives you ideas, tips. If you're having a craving, you just like vape craving, and it sends you back some support, messages from other teens of that age who have dealt with this and stopped. Really cool program. So, you know, any person who, a young person who's trying to stop, I definitely recommend this. Again, I went through their whole 30-day program, I think, as a 16-year-old. I don't often lie about my age online, but I did this time. But check it out if you know someone who needs to stop. It's useful.
I think it's also really important that you don't wait for the school to have these conversations with your kids, that you, as your child is going from 5th grade and getting into middle school, that is the time to have your conversations about vaping, about marijuana use, about social media, because around 6th grade is the time when most kids get smartphones. And what we have found, in addition to an increase of sexting and sharing of inappropriate photos of themselves, which our middle school kids have no concept of, like, the permanency of that, they also have this sort of like unfettered access to the internet. So if you are not watching, if your kids are playing Fortnite and they could be communicating with some 40-year-old dude in their parents' basement who says they're 13 years old. So a lot of the social media and how they get acquainted with this is at home with their social media accounts. So if that, I would say, and I have 2, teenage sons myself, but, I would say that it is my responsibility as a parent to start these conversations and to do my research and to talk to my kids about why this isn't okay and why it's not healthy. Because, we have to partner with you, but to wait and expect any school system to be able to cover that and then that be the way that a child decides not to do it is very unlikely. Us sitting in a classroom and telling you not to vape has a very limited, especially when they're 16 or 17. So I would really recommend that, you use this as a dialogue and you open up conversations with your kid. I do with my kid, and I'm like, so who vapes in your bathrooms? Who does this? Who does that? And what bathrooms do you not go into? Because I want to know that he knows what's going on in his school. So, I mean, I think that's where the best education comes from, is from having an open dialogue with your kids. But start very young. I mean, you start in 5th grade, because if you're going to hand those kids a phone in 6th grade without having any conversations about anything we talked about here or social media, you are in for a rough ride. No, I would never assume that, because we know otherwise from, I was a former dean and I work very closely with Detective Fry and the folks at the high school and the middle schools. But what I would say is, do we need to continue to improve in the way that we engage and educate kids about all of this stuff? Yes. Does it change on a dime in terms of social media and the different ways kids can access information and share information? Absolutely. But Right, but I think also, and you mentioned it earlier, being able to talk to your kids, like, go through scenarios, not just like, this is horrible, this is bad, but like, so you're in a bathroom and someone takes out a vape, what do? My kid's like, I leave the bathroom and I'll go to the nurse's office and use the bathroom, but like giving your kids scenarios, like what would they do? Because you're right, they're not gonna, if they're gonna vape in your house under your roof, like then that's probably a higher level of risky behavior that they're engaging in somewhere else. But it is out there, and so the question is, so like what conversations do you have with your kid? What outs do you give them, right? So when my kids started getting middle school, high school, even when my son who's a freshman in college, like what is his out when someone asks him to do this, that, or the other that he doesn't want to do? And we have conversations and run through scenarios because they need to have that language in their head, so when they're given that situation, they have something to fall back on. They have a script.
The technical term for that is refusal skills. And I assume that we're probably teaching that in health classes. That's where the urine drug screen comes in. Like that's another excuse that you can do. And you could practice refusal skills at home too if you want to, just like Dr. Coleman's suggesting.
Right, well, I think we need, this is our first time having this, and so, and we have had a series of community engagement events. If you saw the movie if you came and saw Angst, and now, this was our third part series. And that's something that we as a district, along with Ela Township, has to continue, to partner and work together with.
And we are partnering. The coalition, the Ela Coalition Against Youth Substance Abuse, this is year 4 of our parent postcard campaign, that every parent of a middle school or high schooler in the district is receiving a postcard just about every 6 to 7 weeks. There's posters in all the schools. It's now become different topics. Actually, the one you just received last week was about vaping. So we're really looking at the Illinois Youth Survey data that our students are telling us about what they're doing. We also survey parents, and we get a great response from the parents of the district about what their thoughts are. And we look and see where are the differences. Parents think they're communicating really well with their kids. Kids are telling us, I'm not hearing what my parents are telling me. So we'll do a postcard on, here's tips of how to maybe talk to your child more effectively or more frequently or whatever it takes to try to get that difference together. And when we see kids are vaping, we see kids are drinking, we're sort of talking, some people perceive that every kid in high school drinks. That's not reality. So here's where reality is, and maybe you're talking to your kid who says, all my friends drink. Really? Because the data tells us it's what, 31% are regular drinkers in the high school, and the perception is it's closer to 80. So a lot of that, and that's what some of the posters are in the high school too, is getting that social norms of not everybody's doing it. You're not the only one not drinking. You're not the only one not vaping. You're not the only one not smoking. There are others out there, and so it's just trying to strike that conversation too between parents and kids, so.
And we are always open to ideas for like how to get more parents in, because we do go to great effort to bring people in and have this, and sometimes we have larger groups and sometimes we don't. And so we are constantly working in partnership with our community on, is it better if we have it at the YMCA? Is it better if we have it at the high school? Is it, how those things work out.
So bathroom attendants, what are we thinking? Is that
No, I have to go through our budget on that and see where we are.
makes bathrooms very classy.
With
I'm just
that,
saying.
yeah,
Well,
yeah.
no, these would be volunteer. No,
Right.
Anyway, yeah. So the question was, how can you best support? Okay. So the question is, how can you best support someone who, another parent who's going through this with a child? So my mind goes first to be compassionate, but I think we tend to be judgy. And the thought is like, oh, what did you do wrong as a parent because your child is doing this? And I think it's really important to recognize that this happens, it cuts through all different things. And so really to make it very clear that this is not like a referendum on someone as a parent, that someone fell into trouble with this. I mean, gosh, I could tell you stories for ages about things that I hear, but I mean, it could be simple as someone starts dating someone who seems fine, but then they are the ones who introduces them to the drug subculture, and then you've got an 18-year-old using heroin. I've heard that one before. And you have no idea about it because a lot of this is happening at school. So just to not be judgy about it, to try to be supportive, to hook people into any resources that they need. I think a lot of times, I've definitely seen that parents are oftentimes hesitant to put their child into a program to help with this, even though it could absolutely help. So really trying to encourage someone particularly if they have insurance, to really use that and to get their child some help. A lot of programs, and I'm not really talking mine up here because I'm way south, but a lot of these programs actually have school integrated into the program. So if they're there, they can do school while they're there during the day, and then they integrate them back in when they're ready to step back. So just really encouraging them to get the help that they need through this process, to give them the support. And also, I'm not as aware of what's in this area, but there's also parent support groups that are present in a lot of places for parents who have kids who are going through addiction, to let them know that they're not alone and that a lot of parents are experiencing this. If that's something that we don't have in this area, that might be a really great
A lot of the
something to-
hospitals that we use, Alexian Brothers or Highland Park or Streamwood or some other places, there's also parent components to that, like the parent education piece is part of that, and they partner with us at the school and with Ms. Belke on reentry, and we provide the education and the materials to the teachers at the hospital so that we can stay connected with our kids upon, reentry as well.
Yeah.
If you see what you would see in the bathroom is a group of kids huddling. You would smell something that smelled like cotton candy or juicy peach or prickly pear or some other mint, some other scent that you might be like, oh, is that Victoria's Secret? No, I don't think so. And last year we did a presentation about vaping, and our deans brought every single imaginable vape and all of the oils and had people go around and smell it, so that you had an idea. So that's what you would see. And if you have a suspicion, I would contact the dean's office, because we also have cameras outside of bathrooms, so that we sometimes pull those videotapes, especially if there's been an incident in the bathroom. Obviously, we do not have video cameras within the bathrooms, but in the hallways by those entrances. So if you, for whatever reason, have a suspicion, I would definitely encourage you to go to the building administration or the deans, because chances are, if you're noticing something about that student, either somebody else has, or we might be a repeat offender. If you have a kid sitting on their desk with their hood over their head and they're like this, you can hide a vape I could hide a vape in my watch band. I could put it in my hair. I could attach it to the inside of my shirt. I could put it in my rolled up pant leg. You could put it in your sock. I mean, you could put it anywhere. They're really small. And so, so you just kind of have to, as you're teaching and you're walking around, and if this kid has his head up and down, I would be like, that's unusual. And so then, if as a sub, you would tell a dean, or even if you were a classroom teacher. No, nope, 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 nope. Because we have a very specific process that we follow and policy on how we investigate and talk to kids, and search and seizure and all those kinds of rules we have to follow. So we have a group of people at the high school who are trained to do that. So no, do not ask a student to empty out their pockets and empty out their bag in front of you and in front of the class. If you see someone with, yeah, bring them to the dean, and then if they say it wasn't me, then Detective Fry will be like, it wasn't them. So. Mm-hmm. Oh, for sure. Yeah. Well, it's really easy, and if you are teaching a class or you're working over here with a student, I mean, as you know, Dr. Weiner said, there's no, it's not like smoking a cigarette where you can smell it, like, and it's not like smoking typical marijuana where you also smell that. You know, it dissipates quickly, and it smells like, yeah, and these kids are really good at it. They know
Yeah.
exactly, you know, how to use it and where to hide it and how to, you know, breathe into it also. No, you wouldn't see anything.
No.
So like, you could be wearing that sweatshirt and have one hidden under your watch band, go like this, and then cough into your shoulder, and you could be vaping all classroom long. Nope. Well, I mean, again, just like buying alcohol, you'd either have to get a fake ID or find someone to go in there and buy it for you and then give it to you. So, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or be like, hey, can I have a look at that sucker? And if they say no, well then,
We had
chances are.
We had an incident at Naperville North like 2 years ago where 13 kids were hospitalized because they ate gummies that were laced with THC and they didn't know it. And it really, they were getting really agitated and paranoid, and I mean, yeah. Yeah. We will probably see more of that. So again, having that conversation, letting them know, like, we have to be very careful about who you're taking candy and baked goods from at this point.
Yeah.
You know?
We don't allow any baked goods in our schools, by the way. We
don't
do
share
not
that.
allow any baked goods in this school. They cannot be sold. They cannot be brought. Anything that's brought into the school for a class party or whatever has to be individually wrapped with all of the ingredients listed on it for peanuts and other things.
Yeah. Well, there are some studies. I mean, so it's kind of, it's a lot stronger of an association that we found consistent across states, that the 18 to 25 group really skyrockets up. And actually, I think over the last 8 years in Colorado, the adult use rate has gone up by 42%, and it doesn't seem to be leveling off. For young people, it actually has been a little bit more variable. There was that recent study that found that it is increasing, though. We know, one study that I can tell you off the top of my head is that there was one study that looked at medical marijuana dispensary density in an area and also exposure to marijuana advertising and young people's perception of harm from marijuana. And they found that, yes, the more dispensaries that are around and the more advertising they view, the less harmful they feel it is. But it's tough because this is a new thing. And it's difficult sometimes to organize these studies. We don't have too many good answers other than what prevention folks are already doing. And again, this is why I come out here.
I mean, I can tell you that at the school that Detective Fry has a device, I'll call it, that every time we pull a vape, we test it to see if there's THC in it. And then go from there, so.
Yeah.
I don't know, Detective Fry, can a parent buy that, or Chief? Yeah. So, although it might be easier to get a urine sample than take the THC and the vape and put it in whatever that device is. I don't know. Okay. Well, this will be posted along with Dr. Weiner's contact information should you have any questions. We really appreciate you coming out. If you have comments, please email, Jean, what is the comment email? feedback@lz95.org. If you have comments or suggestions or things that come to you, we love your feedback from that. So thank you very much for coming. We appreciate it, and have a safe drive home.